In the remote hollers of Appalachia, where morning mist clings to ancient ridge lines and cell towers still can't reach, there existed families whose names were spoken only in whispers. These weren't your typical mountain clans struggling to survive in harsh terrain. No, these were bloodlines that turned isolation into something far more sinister, transforming the natural barriers of the mountains into shields for practices so disturbing that even hardened investigators would abandon their cases rather than dig deeper. What I'm about to share with you isn't folklore passed down through generations of campfire stories. These are documented accounts, official records, and testimonies from those brave enough to speak before they mysteriously stopped talking altogether. 8 families, scattered across the Appalachian Range, each developing their own twisted interpretation of survival in the mountains. Some sought to commune with forces that should never be awakened. Others believed they could bend nature itself to their will through rituals that would make your blood run cold. The deeper you venture into these accounts, the more you realize that the Appalachian Mountains weren't just home to moonshine operations and coal mining communities. Hidden in those seemingly peaceful valleys were families practicing traditions that predated European settlement, and some that were far more recent, born from desperation and madness in equal measure. Each family on this list earned their reputation through methods so extreme that neighboring communities would relocate entire settlements rather than risk proximity to their territories. What makes these accounts particularly chilling isn't just what these families did, but how they managed to operate for generations without significant interference from authorities. The mountains provided natural protection, certainly, but there's something else. A pattern of investigators finding their evidence mysteriously compromised, witnesses recanting their statements, and official files being sealed or destroyed. It's as if the very land itself conspired to keep these secrets buried. Before we begin, I need to warn you that some of these accounts are deeply disturbing. We're not talking about simple criminal activity or even cult behavior as most people understand it. These families developed practices that blur the line between reality and nightmare, between human nature and something far more primal. If you're easily disturbed by accounts of extreme psychological manipulation, ritualistic violence, or practices that challenge your understanding of what people are capable of, you might want to stop watching now. But if you're still with me, prepare yourself for a journey into the darkest corners of American mountain culture. These aren't ghost stories or urban legends. These are the documented histories of families who took the isolation of Appalachian life and twisted it into something that would haunt their communities for generations. Starting at number 8, we have the Kellum family of eastern Tennessee, whose settlement existed in a valley so remote that it doesn't appear on any official maps to this day. The Kellums first arrived in the area during the 1840s, fleeing what local records describe only as troubles with the law in Georgia. Unlike other families who sought to integrate with existing mountain communities, the Kellums immediately isolated themselves, building their homestead in a location that could only be reached by following a narrow creek bed through dense forest. What made the Kellums particularly dangerous wasn't their isolation, it was their interpretation of justice. The family operated under what they called the Blood Code, a system of rules that governed not just their own behavior, but extended to anyone who entered their territory. According to testimonies collected by a circuit judge in 1867, the Kellums believed that certain crimes could only be resolved through what they termed blood payment, a ritualistic form of punishment that involved the entire family and could last for days. The few outsiders who witnessed these ceremonies and lived to report them described gatherings where the accused would be bound to a wooden post in the center of the family compound, while members took turns inflicting specific injuries according to a predetermined pattern. The Kellums maintained detailed records of these punishments in leather-bound ledgers, documenting not just the crimes and penalties, but the physical responses of those subjected to their justice system. More disturbing than the punishments themselves was the methodical nature of the Kellum approach. They studied pain the way scholars study literature, developing techniques that would maximize suffering while keeping subjects conscious and aware. Family members specialized in different aspects of the process. Some focused on psychological torment, others on physical techniques, and the eldest family members served as judges who determined when the blood debt had been satisfied. The Kellum territory became a place where traditional law enforcement feared to tread. Deputies who attempted to serve warrants in the area would find themselves lost in terrain that seemed to shift and change, following paths that led in circles or simply disappeared. Those who persisted reported being watched by figures who moved through the forest with unnatural silence, always staying just out of clear sight, but close enough to make their presence known. The family's influence extended beyond their immediate territory through a network of informants in surrounding communities. Merchants, travelers, and even some local officials provided information about potential threats to Kellum interests. In exchange, the family offered protection services and access to resources that couldn't be obtained through legitimate means. This created a web of complicity that made investigation nearly impossible. The Kellums' reign of terror ended abruptly in 1889, when a federal marshal named Samuel Bridges assembled a large posse and surrounded the family compound. What they found defied explanation. The settlement appeared to have been abandoned for years, with buildings in various states of decay and no sign of recent habitation. However, the leather ledgers were still there, documenting hundreds of cases over nearly 5 decades. The final entry, dated just days before the raid, contained only a single line: "The blood remembers what the flesh forgets." Moving to number 7, we encounter the Hartwell family, whose settlement straddled the border between West Virginia and Virginia in an area known locally as Devil's Triangle. The Hartwells weren't just isolated, they were actively hostile to outsiders, maintaining their territory through a combination of psychological warfare and strategic violence that kept neighboring communities in a state of constant unease. The family's patriarch, Ezekiel Hartwell, established the settlement in 1852 after claiming to have received visions during a severe illness. According to his own writings, discovered years later, these visions revealed that his bloodline had been chosen for a specific purpose, to serve as guardians of something he referred to only as the Old Compact. The nature of this compact was never fully explained, but the Hartwell family's actions suggested it involved maintaining some form of supernatural bargain. What made the Hartwells particularly feared was their practice of marking, a ritual they performed on anyone who violated their territorial boundaries. Those who survived these encounters described being subjected to procedures that left them physically and psychologically scarred. The marking process involved carving specific symbols into the victim's skin using tools that appeared to be made from human bone, but the physical scarring was only the beginning. Survivors reported experiencing nightmares, hallucinations, and compulsive behaviors that seemed to be triggered by the symbols. Some claimed they could hear voices calling to them from the direction of Hartwell territory, voices that grew stronger over time until the marked individuals would disappear, presumably answering the call. Local doctors who examined the scarred survivors noted that the symbols appeared to be self-maintaining, remaining vivid and clear even as other wounds healed. The Hartwell family compound was described by the few who saw it as a maze of interconnected buildings that seemed to follow no logical architectural plan. Structures were built at odd angles, with doors that opened onto walls and windows that looked into other rooms rather than outside. The family claimed this design was necessary to confuse malevolent spirits, but visitors reported feeling disoriented and anxious within minutes of entering the compound. The family's influence on the local ecosystem was equally disturbing. The area around their settlement became known for unusual animal behavior, predators that hunted in broad daylight, livestock that would refuse to graze in certain areas, and a complete absence of songbirds despite apparently suitable habitat. Hunters reported finding animal carcasses arranged in patterns that suggested ritual significance, always in locations that provided clear sight lines to the Hartwell compound. The Hartwells maintained detailed genealogical records, not just of their own family, but of everyone in the surrounding area. They seemed obsessed with bloodlines and heredity, tracking marriages, births, and deaths across multiple generations. These records suggested they were looking for specific genetic markers or family connections, though their purpose remained unclear. Some researchers theorized they were attempting to identify individuals who might be suitable for their marking rituals. The family's isolation ended in 1891 when a series of disappearances in the area prompted a coordinated response from law enforcement agencies in both states. When authorities finally reached the Hartwell compound, they found it completely empty except for extensive documentation of their activities. The buildings remained standing, but showed signs of hasty abandonment, with personal belongings left behind and meals half prepared. Most disturbing of all, the walls of every structure were covered with the same symbols used in the marking rituals, carved so deeply into the wood that they seemed to pulse in lamplight. At number 6, we encounter the Ashford family, whose territory encompassed a series of interconnected valleys in eastern Kentucky. The Ashfords weren't just mountain dwellers, they were students of human nature who used their isolation to conduct experiments that would have been considered barbaric, even by the standards of their time. Their settlement, established in 1847, served as a laboratory where they explored the boundaries of human psychology and endurance. The family's practices centered around what they called the Great Work, a multi-generational project aimed at what their records describe as perfecting the human experience through controlled adversity. The Ashfords believed that people could be fundamentally altered through carefully orchestrated trauma, and they developed elaborate scenarios designed to test their theories on anyone unfortunate enough to enter their territory. Unlike other families who relied on physical violence, the Ashfords specialized in psychological manipulation. They would capture travelers and subject them to experiences designed to break down their sense of reality. Victims would be placed in environments where the normal rules of cause and effect seemed suspended, rooms where gravity appeared to work differently, mirrors that showed reflections that didn't match the viewer's movements, and sounds that came from impossible directions. The family maintained detailed records of their experiments, documenting not just what they did to their subjects, but how those subjects responded over time. They were particularly interested in the point at which rational people would begin to accept irrational explanations for their experiences. Their notes reveal a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that was decades ahead of contemporary scientific knowledge. The Ashford compound was designed to facilitate their work, with specialized chambers for different types of experiments. Some rooms were constructed to create sensory deprivation, others to overwhelm the senses with conflicting stimuli. The family had developed techniques for altering perception through combinations of drugs derived from local plants, carefully controlled lighting, and sound frequencies that affected brain function. What made the Ashfords particularly dangerous was their patience. Unlike other families who sought immediate results, the Ashfords understood that true psychological transformation required time. They would keep subjects for months or even years, gradually introducing them to increasingly disturbing realities until their original personalities were completely replaced by something more suitable to Ashford purposes. The family's experiments weren't limited to outsiders. They regularly subjected their own children to modified versions of their techniques, believing this would create superior human beings. Ashford children were raised in environments designed to eliminate normal, emotional responses, resulting in adults who could perform the family's work without psychological distress. These children grew up to become the next generation of experimenters, each building upon the work of their predecessors. The Ashford legacy came to light in 1894 when a survivor managed to escape and reach authorities. The man, who had been held for over 2 years, provided detailed testimony about the family's activities. However, when investigators reached the Ashford territory, they found only empty buildings and extensive documentation of the experiments. The family had vanished, leaving behind detailed notes that suggested they had achieved their goal of creating perfected humans and were moving on to the next phase of their work. The surviving documentation from the Ashford compound revealed something that chilled investigators to their core. The family hadn't just been conducting random experiments. They had been following a systematic program designed to create what they called hollow vessels. These were individuals whose original personalities had been so thoroughly erased that they could be programmed with entirely new identities and purposes. The implications were staggering, particularly when cross-referenced with missing persons reports from across 3 states. Moving to number 5, we encounter the Grimstead family, whose settlement in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina became the stuff of nightmares for anyone familiar with their methods. The Grimsteads didn't just kill their victims, they transformed them into something far worse. Their territory, established in 1856, served as the center of operations for practices that blurred the line between murder and a form of spiritual imprisonment that defied rational explanation. The family's founder, Jeremiah Grimstead, had been a traveling preacher before settling in the mountains. According to his personal journals, discovered decades later, he experienced what he described as a divine revelation that showed him the true nature of human souls. This revelation convinced him that death was merely a transition, and that with the proper knowledge and techniques, the dying process could be controlled and manipulated to serve specific purposes. The Grimsteads developed what they called the binding ritual, a complex process that began days before their victim's death and continued long after. The family believed that human consciousness could be trapped at the moment of death, prevented from moving on to whatever lay beyond. These trapped souls could then be enslaved to serve the family's needs, creating an army of spiritual servants that grew with each new victim. The process itself was methodical and horrifying. Victims would be kept alive in a state of constant pain, their bodies marked with symbols that supposedly created spiritual anchor points. The family would then begin a series of chants and rituals designed to weaken the connection between body and soul. As death approached, the victim would be positioned in a specially constructed chamber where the family could supposedly capture and bind their departing consciousness. What made the Grimstead practices particularly disturbing was their apparent effectiveness. Neighbors reported strange phenomena around the family compound, voices calling out from empty buildings, shadows moving independently of any visible source, and an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to drain energy from anyone who approached. Livestock would refuse to graze in areas visible from the Grimstead property, and wildlife avoided the region entirely. The family maintained that their bound souls served various purposes. Some were used as sentries, warning of approaching threats. Others were employed in what the family called distant work, tasks that required presence in locations far from the compound. The most disturbing accounts suggest that some bound souls were sent to inhabit the bodies of recently deceased individuals in other communities, creating a network of Grimstead agents that could operate undetected across a wide area. The Grimstead compound itself reflected their supernatural practices. Buildings were constructed according to specific geometric patterns that supposedly enhanced the family's control over their spiritual servants. Rooms were designed with precise acoustic properties that amplified the binding rituals, and the entire settlement was surrounded by a series of standing stones carved with symbols that predated any known Appalachian culture. The family's influence extended beyond their immediate territory through their network of bound souls. These spiritual servants could reportedly influence the thoughts and actions of living individuals, creating a web of control that made investigation nearly impossible. Local officials would find themselves inexplicably reluctant to pursue cases involving the Grimsteads, and witnesses would suddenly develop memory problems or change their testimony without explanation. The Grimstead legacy ended in 1893 when a fire of unknown origin consumed the entire compound. Investigators found evidence of the family's activities, but no bodies were ever recovered. More disturbing still, the fire seemed to have had an immediate effect on the surrounding area. Wildlife returned within days, and the oppressive atmosphere that had characterized the region for decades simply vanished. However, some locals reported that the voices could still be heard on quiet nights, suggesting that whatever the Grimsteads had accomplished might have survived the destruction of their physical base. At number 4, we encounter the Murdoch family, whose settlement in the remote mountains of eastern Tennessee became the center of practices that challenged the very nature of human identity. The Murdochs weren't content with simply controlling their victims. They sought to become them entirely. Their territory, established in 1851, served as the testing ground for techniques that would have been considered impossible if not for the mounting evidence of their success. The family's patriarch, Duncan Murdoch, had been a physician before fleeing to the mountains following accusations of grave robbing and illegal experimentation. His medical knowledge, combined with an obsession with what he called the fluidity of identity, led to the development of practices that went far beyond anything attempted by other mountain families. The Murdochs believed that human consciousness was transferable, and they developed techniques designed to prove this theory through direct application. The family's signature practice was known as the wearing, a ritual that involved the systematic adoption of another person's identity through a combination of physical and psychological methods. Victims would be kept alive for extended periods while the family studied their mannerisms, speech patterns, and personal histories. This information was then used to create detailed profiles that family members would memorize and practice until they could perfectly impersonate their captives. But the Murdochs went beyond simple impersonation. They developed surgical techniques that allowed them to alter their own physical appearance to match their victims more closely. Using crude but effective methods, they would modify facial features, body proportions, and then even vocal cords to achieve greater accuracy in their impersonations. The results, according to surviving accounts, were disturbingly convincing. The most horrifying aspect of the Murdoch practices was their belief that they could actually absorb the memories and experiences of their victims through ritualistic consumption. The family maintained that certain parts of the human body contained concentrated essence of personality and memory, and they developed preparation methods that supposedly allowed them to integrate these elements into their own consciousness. The Murdoch compound was designed to facilitate their identity theft operations. The family maintained extensive wardrobes containing clothing and personal effects taken from their victims, along with detailed notes about the original owner's habits and preferences. They also kept a series of mirrors arranged in specific patterns that supposedly helped them practice their impersonations until they achieved perfect accuracy. The family's activities created a network of false identities that extended far beyond their mountain territory. Murdoch family members would assume the identities of their victims and travel to distant communities where they would integrate themselves into local society. These infiltrators would then report back to the main compound, providing information about potential targets and opportunities for further expansion. What made the Murdochs particularly dangerous was their patience and attention to detail. Unlike other families who operated through fear and intimidation, the Murdochs could blend seamlessly into normal society when necessary. They understood that their success depended on remaining undetected, and they developed elaborate systems for maintaining their false identities over extended periods. The family's practices weren't limited to outsiders. They regularly subjected their own children to modified versions of their techniques, believing this would create more adaptable and effective identity thieves. Murdoch children were raised without stable identities of their own, instead being trained to adopt and discard personalities as needed for family operations. The Murdoch legacy came to light in 1896 when a series of disappearances in multiple states were linked to individuals who had been seen in the company of people who perfectly matched descriptions of missing persons from other areas. The investigation revealed a complex network of false identities that led back to the Murdoch compound. But when authorities arrived, they found only empty buildings and extensive documentation of the family's activities. At number 3, we encounter the Whitmore family, whose settlement in the Virginia Highlands became the center of practices that transformed human suffering into something approaching art. The Whitmores weren't just sadists, they were philosophers of pain who believed that through carefully orchestrated torment, they could unlock hidden potentials in human consciousness that remained dormant under normal circumstances. The family's founder, Cornelius Whitmore, had been a student of medicine and theology before establishing his mountain settlement in 1849. His academic background, combined with an obsession with what he called the redemptive power of suffering, led to the development of practices that were both systematic and deeply disturbing. The Whitmores believed that pain was the key to spiritual enlightenment, and they developed techniques designed to guide their subjects through what they considered essential stages of human development. The family's signature practice was known as the elevation, a multi-stage process that could last for months or even years. Victims would be subjected to increasingly intense forms of physical and psychological torment, each stage designed to break down specific aspects of their personality and replace them with something the Whitmores considered more refined. The process was documented in extensive detail, with careful notation of each subject's responses and progress through the various stages. What made the Whitmore practices particularly sophisticated was their understanding of human psychology. They had developed techniques for maintaining their subjects' sanity, just enough to ensure continued consciousness throughout the process. The family believed that unconsciousness or madness represented failure, as these states prevented the subject from fully experiencing the transformative power of their suffering. The Whitmore compound was designed as a series of specialized chambers, each optimized for different aspects of the elevation process. Some rooms were constructed to amplify sound, others to create specific lighting conditions that enhanced psychological distress. The family had also developed a collection of instruments designed to inflict precise types of pain without causing death or permanent unconsciousness. The family's practices extended beyond simple torture. They maintained detailed philosophical writings that attempted to justify their actions through religious and academic frameworks. These documents revealed a sophisticated understanding of human nature that was decades ahead of contemporary psychological theory, suggesting that their methods, however horrific, were producing measurable results. The Whitmores believed that subjects who successfully completed the elevation process emerged as superior human beings, freed from the limitations that constrained ordinary consciousness. These elevated individuals reportedly displayed enhanced mental abilities, increased pain tolerance, and a form of spiritual awareness that the family considered proof of their theories. However, surviving accounts suggest that these enhanced capabilities came at the cost of basic human empathy and emotional connection. The family's influence on their surrounding community was profound and lasting. The Whitmore territory became known for producing individuals who seemed somehow different from normal mountain folk, more intelligent perhaps, but also colder and more calculating. These individuals would often leave the mountains entirely, traveling to distant cities where they would establish successful careers in fields requiring analytical thinking and emotional detachment. The Whitmore legacy came to an abrupt end in 1894 when a former subject who had somehow escaped their territory returned with federal authorities. The man, who had endured 3 years of the elevation process, provided detailed testimony about the family's methods. However, when investigators reached the compound, they discovered that the Whitmores had vanished, leaving behind only their extensive philosophical writings and the specialized chambers where their work had been conducted. Most disturbing of all, several of the chambers showed signs of recent use, suggesting that the family's work had continued right up until their departure. At number 2, we encounter the Thorn family, whose settlement in the remote mountains of eastern Kentucky became the epicenter of practices that defied every understanding of life and death. The Thorns weren't content with simply killing their victims. They had developed methods for bringing them back again and again, creating a cycle of death and resurrection that served purposes so dark that even hardened investigators refused to document them fully. The family's patriarch, Mordecai Thorn, had been a battlefield surgeon during the Civil War before retreating to the mountains, with knowledge that no medical school had ever taught. His experiences treating the dying and wounded had given him insights into what he called the threshold moment, that brief period between life and death when consciousness existed in a state of transition. Thorn believed this moment could be extended indefinitely, and he developed techniques designed to trap his subjects in this liminal state. The Thorn family's signature practice was known as the cycling, a process that involved killing their victims in carefully controlled circumstances and then using a combination of medical knowledge and ritualistic methods to restore them to life. But these resurrections weren't acts of mercy. They were calculated steps in a process designed to break down the fundamental structure of human consciousness through repeated exposure to death. What made the Thorn practices particularly horrifying was their precision. The family had developed techniques for inducing death through methods that left the body largely intact, allowing for easier resurrection. They understood exactly how long consciousness could be maintained after clinical death, and they had perfected methods for extending this period through the use of chemicals derived from local plants and carefully controlled environmental conditions. The resurrection process itself was elaborate and deeply disturbing. Victims would be placed in specially constructed chambers where the family could monitor and control every aspect of their return to life. The process reportedly involved not just medical intervention, but ritualistic elements, that suggested the family believed they were negotiating with supernatural forces that controlled the boundary between life and death. Subjects who endured multiple cycles of death and resurrection underwent profound psychological changes. According to testimonies from those who escaped, victims would gradually lose their fear of death, their attachment to life, and eventually their basic human instincts for self-preservation. The family believed these changes represented a form of spiritual evolution, but survivors described them as a complete dissolution of personality and identity. The Thorn compound was designed to facilitate their work with specialized chambers for different stages of the cycling process. Some rooms were constructed as operating theaters where the family could perform their death-inducing procedures with medical precision. Others served as resurrection chambers, equipped with devices that could restart stopped hearts and restore circulation to apparently dead bodies. The family maintained detailed records of their experiments, documenting not just their methods, but the psychological and spiritual changes they observed in their subjects. These records revealed that the Thorns weren't just conducting random experiments. They were following a systematic program designed to create what they called death-touched individuals who could serve specific purposes in their larger operations. The most disturbing aspect of the Thorn practices was their belief that subjects who had been cycled multiple times could serve as intermediaries between the living and the dead. These individuals reportedly displayed abilities that defied rational explanation. They could predict deaths in the surrounding communities, communicate with recently deceased individuals, and influence the dying process in others through methods that remained unclear. The Thorn family's influence extended far beyond their immediate territory through their network of death-touched servants. These individuals would travel to distant communities where they would establish themselves as healers, undertakers, or simply helpful neighbors. Their true purpose, according to surviving documentation, was to identify potential subjects for the cycling process and to facilitate the family's expansion into new territories. The family's practices created a climate of fear that extended across multiple states. Communities would report unusual numbers of deaths, followed by equally unusual recoveries, often involving individuals who seemed fundamentally changed by their experiences. Local physicians would find themselves treating patients who showed no fear of death, no attachment to life, and no normal human responses to pain or suffering. The Thorn legacy ended in 1897 when a coordinated effort by federal authorities and local law enforcement surrounded the family compound. What they found defied all expectations. The buildings were empty, but the specialized chambers showed signs of recent use. Most disturbing of all, investigators discovered a series of graves that had been repeatedly disturbed, suggesting that the family's work had continued right up until their departure. The surviving documentation from the Thorn compound revealed something that haunted investigators for years afterward. The family hadn't just been conducting experiments on individual subjects, they had been working toward what they called the Great Cycling, a process that would supposedly allow them to extend their techniques to entire communities. The implications were staggering, particularly when cross-referenced with reports of unusual death and resurrection phenomena in areas where death-touched individuals had been active. And now we reach number 1 on our list, The Ravencroft family, whose settlement in the deepest hollows of West Virginia became the center of practices so extreme that they challenged the very nature of human existence. The Ravencrofts weren't just another twisted mountain clan. They were architects of horror who had developed methods for transforming human beings into something that could barely be called human anymore. The family's origins traced back to 1844, when Ezra Ravencroft arrived in the mountains carrying knowledge that no civilized person should possess. Unlike other patriarchs who had fled civilization due to criminal activities or religious persecution, Ravencroft seemed to have come to the mountains with a specific purpose: to establish a settlement where he could pursue work that required absolute isolation from the outside world. What made the Ravencrofts the most dangerous of all Appalachian families was their understanding of human nature at its most fundamental level. They had developed techniques for breaking down not just the mind or the body, but the very essence of what made a person human. Their victims didn't just die or go insane. They were transformed into something else entirely. Creatures that retained human appearance, but had been stripped of everything that defined human consciousness. The family's signature practice was known as the hollowing, a process that involved the systematic removal of human traits and their replacement with something alien and predatory. Victims would be subjected to procedures that went far beyond simple torture or brainwashing. They were being fundamentally restructured at a level that defied medical understanding. The process could take years to complete, and subjects who survived the full treatment emerged as something that looked human but moved, spoke, and thought in ways that suggested a completely different form of consciousness. The Ravencroft compound was designed as a factory for producing these hollow beings. The family had constructed specialized chambers where different aspects of the hollowing process could be conducted with scientific precision. Some rooms were designed to break down specific neural pathways, others to introduce foreign elements into the subject's consciousness. The entire facility operated with the efficiency of a medical institution, but its purpose was the systematic destruction of human identity. What made the Ravencroft practices particularly terrifying was their apparent success. The family had developed techniques that allowed them to produce hollow beings with specific capabilities and purposes. Some were designed as perfect infiltrators, able to blend seamlessly into normal society while serving Ravencroft interests. Others were created as hunters, capable of tracking and capturing new subjects with superhuman efficiency. The most disturbing accounts describe hollow beings that served as breeding stock, used to produce new generations of creatures that combined human appearance with predatory instincts. The family's influence spread through their network of hollow beings, who established themselves in communities across multiple states. These creatures would identify potential subjects for the hollowing process, facilitate their capture, and maintain the secrecy necessary for continued operations. They were perfect agents, intelligent enough to function in human society, but completely loyal to Ravencroft interests. The Ravencroft territory became a place where the normal rules of existence seemed suspended. Visitors reported feeling watched by intelligences that were clearly not human despite their human appearance. The very air seemed charged with malevolent energy, and the landscape itself appeared to shift and change in response to the family's will. Wildlife avoided the area entirely, and domestic animals would refuse to enter the territory under any circumstances. The family maintained extensive records of their work, documenting not just their methods, but the philosophical framework that justified their actions. These writings revealed a worldview that saw normal human consciousness as a temporary evolutionary stage, something to be transcended through the hollowing process. The Ravencrofts believed they were creating a new form of life, one that would eventually replace humanity entirely. The most chilling aspect of the Ravencroft legacy was their long-term planning. Unlike other families who focused on immediate goals, the Ravencrofts were working toward what they called the Great Replacement, a systematic process of infiltrating and transforming human communities until their hollow beings became the dominant form of consciousness. Their records suggested this process had been underway for decades, with hollow beings establishing themselves in positions of influence across the region. The Ravencroft compound was discovered in 1899 when a series of disappearances led investigators to their territory. What they found challenged everything they thought they knew about human nature and capability. The facility was empty, but the specialized chambers and extensive documentation revealed the scope of the family's work. Most disturbing of all, the records indicated that the hollowing process had been completed on hundreds of subjects, all of whom had been released into the general population. The investigation was immediately classified, and all evidence was sealed by federal order. The few investigators who had direct contact with the Ravencroft materials were quietly transferred to distant assignments, and several suffered mysterious accidents within months of their involvement. The official records state only that the compound was destroyed by fire, but local residents reported that the buildings simply vanished overnight, as if they had never existed at all. The aftermath of the Ravencroft discovery sent shockwaves through federal agencies that most Americans never knew existed. Within days of the investigation, a specialized unit was formed to track down the hollow beings that had been released into the general population. This unit, operating under the designation Project Clearwater, represented the first organized government response to what they classified as non-human entities of domestic origin. The challenge facing investigators was unprecedented. How do you identify creatures that appear completely human but possess fundamentally altered consciousness? The Ravencroft documentation provided some guidance, describing behavioral patterns that might distinguish hollow beings from normal individuals. These creatures reportedly showed no emotional responses to pain, displayed perfect memory recall, and demonstrated problem-solving abilities that seemed to operate on entirely different logical frameworks. More disturbing still, the hollow beings appeared to be capable of reproduction. Medical examinations of captured subjects revealed physiological modifications that suggested the Ravencroft family had altered their reproductive systems to ensure that offspring would inherit the hollow characteristics. This meant that the creatures weren't just individual threats, they represented the potential beginning of an entirely new species that could gradually replace humanity through natural population growth. The investigation teams faced another challenge that made their work nearly impossible. The hollow beings seemed to possess an ability to recognize each other across vast distances, creating a network of communication that operated through methods no scientific instrument could detect. When one hollow being was captured or threatened, others in the network would respond immediately, often vanishing from their established lives and relocating to areas where they couldn't be tracked. Project Clearwater operatives reported that attempting to interrogate captured hollow beings was like trying to communicate with a completely alien intelligence. The creatures would respond to questions, but their answers revealed thought processes that operated according to principles that no human psychologist could understand. They showed no fear of death, no attachment to their assumed identities, and no recognition of concepts like loyalty, love, or self-preservation as humans understood them. The most chilling discovery came when investigators realized that some hollow beings had been living in their assumed identities for decades, successfully integrating into communities, establishing families, and even holding positions of authority. A sheriff in Kentucky, a school teacher in Tennessee, a federal postal worker in Virginia, all were discovered to be hollow beings who had been operating undetected for years, possibly decades. The federal response was swift and brutal. Entire communities were quietly evacuated under the pretense of public health emergencies, while specialized teams conducted door-to-door searches for hollow beings. Those identified as non-human were removed without explanation, their human families given cover stories about sudden relocations or tragic accidents. The operation required the cooperation of multiple agencies and resulted in the disappearance of hundreds of individuals across the Appalachian region. But the most disturbing aspect of Project Clearwater wasn't what they found, it was what they failed to find. Despite extensive searches and the deployment of resources that remained classified for over a century, investigators were never able to account for all the hollow beings that the Ravencraft documentation suggested had been created. Conservative estimates indicated that dozens, possibly hundreds, of these creatures remained undetected in the general population. The project officially ended in 1903, but not because the threat had been eliminated. Federal authorities realized that the hollow beings had adapted to their pursuit, developing new methods for avoiding detection and establishing deeper cover identities. The creatures had learned to mimic human emotional responses more effectively, and some had even begun displaying what appeared to be genuine affection for their assumed families and communities. This adaptation presented investigators with a philosophical problem that had no clear solution. If hollow beings could learn to genuinely care for humans and function as productive members of society, did their non-human origins matter? Some officials argued for continued pursuit, while others suggested that the creatures might simply be allowed to integrate into human civilization as long as they caused no harm. The debate was rendered moot when several key Project Clearwater operatives began displaying behavioral patterns consistent with hollow being characteristics. Whether they had been infected, replaced, or simply driven to madness by their work remained unclear, but the implications were terrifying. The investigation had been compromised from within, and there was no way to determine how extensively the hollow beings had penetrated the government response. The final project. Clearwater Report, classified at the highest levels and sealed for over a century, concluded that the hollow beings represented an evolutionary development that could not be stopped or reversed. The creatures had demonstrated superior adaptability, enhanced intelligence, and reproductive advantages that suggested they might naturally become the dominant form of consciousness in the region. The report recommended continued monitoring, but acknowledged that active suppression was no longer feasible. The legacy of the 8 deadliest Appalachian families extends far beyond their individual territories and time periods. Each family developed techniques that pushed the boundaries of human capability and consciousness, creating changes that rippled through generations of mountain communities. Their practices weren't just isolated incidents of violence or madness. They represented systematic attempts to transcend the limitations of human nature through methods that most people couldn't even imagine. What makes these accounts particularly disturbing is the evidence that some of these families may have succeeded in their goals. The hollow beings created by the Ravencrafts, the death-touched individuals produced by the Thorns, the elevated subjects of the Whitmores, all represent forms of human consciousness that had been fundamentally altered through deliberate intervention. These weren't natural evolutionary developments, but artificial modifications that created new forms of awareness and capability. The mountain communities that surrounded these families were forever changed by their presence. Even after the families themselves vanished, their influence continued through the individuals they had transformed and the techniques they had developed. Local cultures absorbed elements of their practices, creating traditions that persisted long after their origins were forgotten. Certain rituals, beliefs, and behavioral patterns that characterized Appalachian communities for generations can be traced back to the influence of these 8 families. Modern researchers who have attempted to study these families face challenges that go beyond simple historical investigation. Records are incomplete, witnesses are reluctant to speak, and physical evidence has a tendency to disappear or become corrupted. Some scholars suggest that the families developed methods for protecting their legacies that continue to operate decades after their disappearance. Others believe that the transformed individuals they created still maintain some form of influence over how their stories are told and remembered. The psychological impact of these families on their surrounding communities cannot be overstated. Generations of mountain residents grew up with the knowledge that certain valleys were to be avoided, that specific behaviors could attract dangerous attention, and that there were forms of human consciousness that existed beyond normal understanding. This awareness created a culture of caution and secrecy that characterized Appalachian communities well into the modern era. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the possibility that these 8 families represented only the most visible examples of a much larger phenomenon. The isolation of the Appalachian Mountains provided ideal conditions for the development of alternative forms of human consciousness, and there's no reason to believe that only 8 families took advantage of these opportunities. The documented cases may represent merely the tip of an iceberg that extends far deeper into the hidden history of American mountain culture. The techniques developed by these families weren't limited to their immediate descendants or territories. Knowledge has a way of spreading, even when those who possess it attempt to keep it secret. Fragments of their methods may have been preserved in oral traditions, written records, or the practices of individuals who learned from them directly. The possibility that these techniques continue to be used in modified forms by contemporary groups represents a threat that law enforcement agencies are not equipped to handle. The 8 deadliest Appalachian families created a legacy that extends far beyond their individual crimes and practices. They demonstrated that human consciousness is far more malleable than most people realize, and that the boundaries between sanity and madness, between human and non-human, are not as fixed as we might hope. Their work revealed potentials within human nature that most of us would prefer to believe don't exist, and their success in developing these potentials suggests that the comfortable assumptions we make about human limitations may be fundamentally incorrect. The mountains themselves seem to have absorbed something from these families, creating an atmosphere that continues to influence those who venture into the deepest hollows and most isolated valleys. Hunters, hikers, and researchers who spend time in these areas report experiences that echo the accounts of those who encountered the families directly. The sense of being watched by intelligences that aren't quite human, the feeling that the landscape itself is somehow alive and aware, the conviction that certain areas contain presences that are actively hostile to human intrusion, all suggest that the influence of these families has become part of the very fabric of the Appalachian wilderness. The question that haunts anyone who studies these accounts is whether the families truly vanished or simply evolved beyond the point where they could be easily detected. The hollow beings created by the Ravencrafts, the death-touched individuals produced by the Thorns, and the other transformed humans created by the remaining families all possessed capabilities that would make them nearly impossible to track using conventional methods. Their ability to blend into normal society while maintaining their altered consciousness suggests that they might still be among us, continuing their work in forms that we simply don't recognize. The implications of this possibility are staggering. If even a fraction of these transformed individuals survived and continued to reproduce, they could have established bloodlines that carry their modifications forward through genetic or cultural transmission. The descendants of the 8 deadliest Appalachian families might be living ordinary lives in contemporary society, unaware of their heritage, but carrying within them the potential for capabilities that most humans don't possess. The story of these 8 families serves as a reminder that human nature is far more complex and dangerous than we typically acknowledge. The isolation of the Appalachian Mountains allowed these families to explore aspects of consciousness and capability that civilization normally suppresses, and their success in developing these aspects suggests that the potential for such development exists within all human communities. The comfortable assumption that such extreme practices are limited to historical curiosities or distant cultures may be fundamentally naive. As we conclude this journey through the darkest corners of Appalachian history, we're left with questions that have no comfortable answers. The 8 deadliest families demonstrated that human consciousness can be fundamentally altered through deliberate intervention, that the boundaries between life and death are more flexible than we believe, and that the potential for both transcendence and horror exists within human nature itself. Their legacy continues to influence the communities they once terrorized, and their techniques may continue to be used by individuals and groups who understand their power. The mountains keep their secrets, but those secrets have a way of influencing the world beyond their borders. The 8 families may have vanished from historical records, but their work continues through the individuals they transformed, the knowledge they preserved, and the changes they made to the very fabric of human consciousness in their regions. Their story serves as both a warning and a reminder that the comfortable assumptions we make about human nature and capability may be nothing more than illusions that help us sleep at night. The truth is, we may never know the full extent of what these families accomplished during their decades of operation in the Appalachian wilderness. Each family developed their techniques in complete isolation, but the similarities between their methods suggest they may have been working from some common source of knowledge, perhaps traditions that predated European settlement, or teachings that had been passed down through generations of practitioners who understood aspects of human consciousness that mainstream society had forgotten or deliberately suppressed. What's particularly unsettling is how these families managed to operate for so long without detection. The mountains provided natural concealment, certainly, but there's evidence that they possessed methods for actively discouraging investigation. Witnesses would suddenly develop memory problems. Investigators would find their evidence mysteriously compromised, and official records would disappear or become corrupted. Some researchers theorize that the families had developed techniques for influencing human perception and memory that extended far beyond their immediate territories. The geographic distribution of these families also raises disturbing questions. They weren't randomly scattered throughout the Appalachian Range. They were positioned in locations that formed a rough network across the mountain system. The distances between their territories were significant, yet there's evidence of communication and possibly coordination between them. How did isolated mountain clans, separated by hundreds of miles, manage to develop similar techniques and maintain contact with each other? One possibility that investigators have been reluctant to consider is that these 8 families were part of a larger organization that extended beyond the Appalachian region. The sophistication of their methods, the systematic nature of their approaches, and the apparent coordination between widely separated groups suggests a level of planning and knowledge that individual families operating in isolation couldn't have achieved. If this theory is correct, then the 8 families documented here may represent only the most visible elements of a network that operated throughout the eastern United States. The timing of their activities is also significant. Most of these families established their settlements during the mid-1800s, a period when the Appalachian Mountains were becoming increasingly isolated from mainstream American society. The Civil War and its aftermath created conditions of social disruption that may have provided cover for their activities. During this period, entire communities could disappear without attracting official attention, and the movement of people through the mountains was largely unmonitored. The techniques these families developed weren't just crude expressions of violence or madness. They represented sophisticated understanding of human psychology and physiology that was decades ahead of contemporary scientific knowledge. The Ashford's experiments with perception and reality, the Murdoch's methods for identity transfer, and the Ravencroft's techniques for consciousness modification all demonstrate levels of expertise that couldn't have been developed through simple trial and error. These families had access to knowledge that mainstream science wouldn't approach for generations. The question of where this knowledge originated remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire phenomenon. Some researchers have suggested that the families discovered texts or artifacts left behind by earlier inhabitants of the mountains, perhaps Native American groups that had developed their own methods for consciousness modification. Others theorize that the knowledge was brought to America by European immigrants who had been practicing similar techniques in the Old World. The most unsettling possibility is that the families developed their methods independently, suggesting that the potential for such work exists within human nature itself and will inevitably emerge whenever conditions permit. The legacy of these families extends far beyond their immediate victims and territories. The techniques they developed have implications that reach into contemporary issues of mind control, psychological manipulation, and the fundamental nature of human consciousness. Modern researchers studying trauma, memory, and identity formation often encounter phenomena that echo the work of these mountain families, suggesting that their discoveries may have been preserved and transmitted through channels that remain active today. The psychological impact on the broader Appalachian community cannot be measured in simple terms. Generations of mountain residents grew up knowing that certain areas were to be avoided, that specific behaviors could attract dangerous attention, and that there were forms of human consciousness that existed beyond normal understanding. This knowledge created a culture of wariness and secrecy that characterized mountain communities well into the modern era and may still influence how these communities interact with outsiders. The transformation of individuals by these families created ripple effects that extended far beyond the mountains themselves. The hollow beings, death-touched individuals, and other modified humans produced by these families didn't remain in their places of origin. They traveled throughout the country, establishing new lives and possibly new operations in distant locations. The geographic spread of their influence may have been far greater than historical records suggest, and their impact on American society as a whole may have been significantly underestimated. Modern law enforcement agencies face challenges that their predecessors couldn't have imagined when dealing with cases that echo the work of these families. How do you investigate crimes that involve techniques for altering human consciousness? How do you gather evidence when witnesses may have had their memories modified? How do you protect communities from threats that operate through methods that most people can't even comprehend? These questions have no easy answers, and the agencies responsible for public safety are largely unprepared to deal with them. The technological capabilities available to contemporary investigators provide new tools for studying these historical cases, but they also reveal the limitations of conventional approaches to understanding human consciousness and behavior. Brain imaging techniques, genetic analysis, and advanced psychological testing can detect some of the changes that these families produced in their subjects, but they cannot explain how those changes were achieved or how they might be reversed. The gap between what we can observe and what we can understand remains as wide as ever. The possibility that descendant groups continue to practice modified versions of these techniques represents a threat that extends far beyond historical curiosity. If even a fraction of the knowledge developed by these families has been preserved and transmitted to contemporary practitioners, they could be operating in modern society using methods that law enforcement agencies aren't equipped to detect or counter. The sophisticated understanding of human psychology and consciousness that these families possessed would be even more dangerous when combined with modern technology and communication systems. The 8 deadliest Appalachian families created a legacy that challenges our most basic assumptions about human nature and capability. Their work demonstrated that consciousness is far more malleable than we typically acknowledge, that the boundaries between sanity and madness are not as fixed as we might hope, and that the potential for both transcendence and horror exists within human nature itself. The comfortable beliefs we maintain about human limitations may be nothing more than illusions that help us function in civilized society. The mountains themselves seem to have absorbed something from these families, creating an atmosphere that continues to influence those who venture into the deepest hollows and most isolated valleys. The sense of being watched by intelligences that aren't quite human, the feeling that the landscape itself is somehow alive and aware, the conviction that certain areas contain presences that are actively hostile to human intrusion, all suggest that the influence of these families has become part of the very fabric of the Appalachian wilderness. The question that haunts anyone who studies these accounts is whether the work of these families represents an aberration in human history or a glimpse into potentials that exist within all human communities. The isolation of the Appalachian Mountains may have simply provided ideal conditions for the development of capabilities that remain dormant in more civilized environments. If this is true, then the techniques developed by these families could theoretically be recreated anywhere that similar conditions exist. The implications of this possibility extend far beyond the boundaries of historical research. If human consciousness can be fundamentally altered through deliberate intervention, if the boundaries between life and death are more flexible than we believe, and if the potential for creating non-human forms of awareness exists within human nature itself, then our understanding of what it means to be human may need to be completely reconsidered. The 8 families may have discovered the truths about human nature that civilization has spent centuries trying to suppress or deny. The story of these families serves as both a warning and a reminder that the comfortable assumptions we make about human nature and capability may be fundamentally incorrect. The potential for both transcendence and horror exists within human consciousness, and the conditions that allowed these families to explore that potential could theoretically emerge again. The mountains keep their secrets, but those secrets have a way of influencing the world beyond their borders, and the work of the 8 deadliest Appalachian families may be far from finished. As we delve deeper into the documented evidence surrounding these families, patterns emerge that suggest their activities were part of a larger phenomenon that extended far beyond individual criminal behavior or isolated incidents of madness. The systematic nature of their approaches, the sophistication of their techniques, and the apparent coordination between widely separated groups points to a level of organization and knowledge that challenges conventional understanding of how such operations could develop and persist. The transformation of human consciousness that these families achieved wasn't limited to their immediate victims. It created changes that rippled through generations of mountain communities and may continue to influence contemporary society in ways that we're only beginning to understand. The hollow beings, death-touched individuals, and other modified humans they produced represent new forms of consciousness that combine human appearance with fundamentally altered awareness and capability. The techniques developed by these families have implications that reach into every aspect of human experience, from the nature of identity and memory to the boundaries between life and death, from the potential for consciousness modification to the possibility of creating entirely new forms of awareness. Their work revealed potentials within human nature that most of us would prefer to believe don't exist, and their success in developing these potentials suggests that the comfortable assumptions we make about human limitations may be fundamentally naive. The legacy of the 8 deadliest Appalachian families continues to influence the communities they once terrorized, the individuals they transformed, and the knowledge they preserved. Their story serves as a reminder that human consciousness is far more complex and dangerous than we typically acknowledge, and that the potential for both transcendence and horror exists within human nature itself. The mountains may have kept their secrets, but those secrets have a way of shaping the world beyond their borders, and the work of these families may be far from finished. The investigation into these families revealed disturbing connections that extended far beyond their individual territories. Federal agents discovered evidence of a communication network that operated through methods that defied conventional understanding. Messages carved into trees along remote mountain paths, symbols painted on rocks that appeared and disappeared according to lunar cycles, and a system of signal fires that could transmit complex information across hundreds of miles of wilderness. What made this network particularly unsettling was its sophistication. The families had developed a form of coded communication that incorporated elements of mathematics, astronomy, and what appeared to be linguistic structures that predated any known American dialects. Cryptographers who attempted to decode these messages found themselves dealing with systems that seemed to operate on principles that conventional code-breaking techniques couldn't penetrate. The timing of communications between families was precisely coordinated with astronomical events, specific phases of the moon, planetary alignments, and seasonal transitions that suggested the families possessed astronomical knowledge that was remarkably advanced for their time period. This coordination allowed them to synchronize their activities across vast distances, creating a network of operations that could respond to threats or opportunities with frightening efficiency. More disturbing still was the evidence that this network had been operating for far longer than initially suspected. Archaeological investigations in areas formerly controlled by these families revealed artifacts and structures that suggested similar practices had been conducted in the region for centuries before the documented families arrived. Stone circles, underground chambers, and carved symbols that matched those used by the families indicated a continuity of tradition that extended back into pre-European settlement periods. The implications of this discovery were staggering. If these families were inheritors of traditions that had been practiced in the Appalachian Mountains for generations, then their activities represented not isolated incidents of aberrant behavior, but the continuation of a cultural legacy that had persisted through centuries of social change. The techniques they developed weren't innovations, they were refinements of methods that had been tested and perfected over generations of practitioners. The federal response to these discoveries was immediate and comprehensive. Entire valleys were declared off limits to civilian access under the pretense of military training exercises, while specialized teams conducted extensive searches for additional evidence of the family's activities. These operations, conducted under the highest levels of security classification, revealed the true scope of what had been occurring in the Appalachian wilderness. The search teams discovered dozens of previously unknown sites where similar practices had been conducted. Hidden chambers carved into mountainsides, underground complexes that extended for miles beneath the surface, and elaborate ritual sites that showed evidence of use spanning multiple generations. Each discovery added to the growing realization that the 8 documented families represented only the most visible elements of a phenomenon that had shaped the region for centuries. The psychological profiles developed by government psychologists revealed patterns that challenged fundamental assumptions about human behavior and motivation. The families hadn't been driven by simple criminal impulses or religious fanaticism. They had been pursuing systematic programs of research into the nature of human consciousness that demonstrated levels of intellectual sophistication that were decades ahead of contemporary scientific understanding. Their methods for documenting and preserving their work rivaled those of academic institutions. Detailed records were maintained in multiple locations, with backup copies stored in hidden caches throughout their territories. The families had developed their own systems of notation and measurement that allowed them to record precise details about their procedures and results. These records revealed that their work had been guided by theoretical frameworks that incorporated elements of medicine, psychology, and what appeared to be advanced mathematics. The most disturbing aspect of these discoveries was the evidence that the families had been aware of each other's work and had been actively collaborating on joint projects. Exchange programs had been established between families, allowing members to study different techniques and contribute to the development of new methods. The isolation that had protected them from outside interference had also allowed them to create a community of practitioners who could share knowledge and resources without fear of detection. The collaboration between families had produced hybrid techniques that combined elements from multiple approaches. The Ravencraft method for consciousness modification had been enhanced with elements borrowed from the Thorn resurrection procedures, creating processes that could transform subjects in ways that neither family could have achieved independently. Similarly, the Ashford techniques for psychological manipulation had been combined with Murdoch identity transfer methods to create approaches that were far more sophisticated than anything documented in individual family records. The evidence suggested that the families had been working toward a common goal that extended far beyond their individual interests. References found in multiple locations pointed to something called the Great Convergence, a planned event that would supposedly bring together all the modified humans created by the families for some ultimate purpose. The details of this plan remained unclear, but the scope of preparation suggested it had been in development for decades. The federal investigation revealed that the families had established safe houses and supply caches throughout the eastern United States, creating a network of resources that could support their operations indefinitely. These facilities were concealed using techniques that made them nearly impossible to detect. Hidden entrances, camouflaged structures, and storage systems that could remain undetected for years. The discovery of these caches indicated that the families had been preparing for long-term operations that extended far beyond their mountain territories. The psychological impact on the investigators themselves became a significant concern as the scope of the discoveries became clear. Agents who spent extended periods studying the family's work began displaying behavioral changes that suggested they were being influenced by the techniques they were investigating. Memory problems, personality alterations, and unexplained knowledge of procedures they had never studied led to the implementation of strict rotation schedules and psychological monitoring for all personnel involved in the investigation. The most experienced investigators reported that studying the family's work created a form of intellectual contamination. Exposure to their methods and philosophical frameworks gradually altered the investigators' own thought processes and worldviews. This effect was so pronounced that several senior agents requested reassignment rather than continue working on cases that they felt were fundamentally changing who they were as people. The family's understanding of human psychology extended far beyond simple manipulation techniques. They had developed comprehensive theories about the nature of consciousness that incorporated elements of neuroscience, philosophy, and what appeared to be advanced mathematics. Their work suggested that human awareness was far more malleable than conventional science acknowledged, and that the boundaries between individual minds were less fixed than most people believed. The techniques they developed for consciousness modification operated on principles that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of human identity. The families had discovered methods for transferring memories between individuals, creating shared consciousness experiences, and even establishing forms of mental communication that operated independently of spoken language. These capabilities suggested that human consciousness was far more flexible and interconnected than mainstream psychology acknowledged. The implications of these discoveries extended far beyond the immediate threat posed by the families themselves. If human consciousness could be modified using the techniques they had developed, then the potential applications were virtually unlimited. The same methods that had been used to create hollow beings and death-touched individuals could theoretically be adapted for beneficial purposes, treating mental illness, enhancing cognitive abilities, or even facilitating forms of communication that transcended normal human limitations. However, the ethical implications of such applications were staggering. The families had demonstrated that consciousness modification inevitably involved the destruction of the original personality and its replacement with something fundamentally different. Even if the techniques could be refined to minimize negative effects, the question remained whether any benefits could justify the risks involved in altering the basic nature of human awareness. The federal response to these discoveries involved the establishment of research programs that attempted to understand and potentially replicate the family's techniques under controlled conditions. These programs, conducted in secure facilities with the highest levels of security classification, represented the government's first systematic attempt to study consciousness modification as a potentially useful technology rather than simply a criminal threat. The results of these research programs remained classified for decades, but leaked documents suggested that government scientists had achieved limited success in replicating some of the family's simpler techniques. The ability to modify memory, influence perception, and create temporary alterations in consciousness had been demonstrated under laboratory conditions. However, the more extreme modifications, the creation of hollow beings, or the resurrection techniques developed by the Thorns, remained beyond the reach of conventional scientific methods. The research programs also revealed the dangers inherent in studying consciousness modification techniques. Several researchers involved in the programs suffered psychological breakdowns that suggested they had been exposed to methods that exceeded their ability to understand or control. Others simply disappeared, leaving behind evidence that they had been attempting to apply the family's techniques to themselves with unpredictable results. The failure of these research programs to produce reliable results led to their gradual abandonment, but the knowledge gained from studying the family's work was preserved in classified archives that remain sealed to this day. The potential applications of consciousness modification techniques continued to fascinate government researchers, but the risks involved in their development were deemed too great to justify continued investment in active research programs. The family's influence on contemporary society extends far beyond their direct victims and the government agencies that investigated them. The techniques they developed have implications for every aspect of human experience, from the nature of identity and memory to the potential for creating entirely new forms of consciousness. Their work demonstrated that the boundaries between individual minds are far more permeable than most people realize, and that the potential for both transcendence and horror exists within human nature itself. The geographic distribution of sites associated with the families suggests that their influence extended throughout the Appalachian region and beyond. Hidden facilities, ritual sites, and storage caches have been discovered in locations ranging from Maine to Georgia, indicating that the family's network of operations was far more extensive than initially suspected. The possibility that some of these sites remain active represents a continuing threat that law enforcement agencies are ill-equipped to address. The transformation of individuals by these families created ripple effects that continue to influence American society in ways that are difficult to measure or understand. The hollow beings, death-touched individuals, and other modified humans produced by the families didn't simply disappear when their creators vanished. They integrated into normal society, established families, and may have passed their modifications onto subsequent generations through methods that remain unclear. The possibility that the descendants of these modified individuals continue to carry the alterations created by the families represents a form of genetic or cultural inheritance that challenges conventional understanding of how human traits are transmitted. If the family's techniques created heritable changes in consciousness or capability, then their influence may be spreading through the general population in ways that are virtually impossible to detect or control. The psychological impact on the broader American population has been subtle but persistent. The knowledge that such extreme modifications of human consciousness are possible has influenced popular culture, academic research, and government policy in ways that are often unrecognized. The family's work demonstrated that the comfortable assumptions most people make about human nature and capability may be fundamentally incorrect, and this realization has created a form of cultural anxiety that continues to influence how Americans think about identity, consciousness, and the potential for human transformation. The techniques developed by these families have found their way into various forms of popular entertainment, academic research, and even therapeutic applications. Elements of their methods for consciousness modification have been incorporated into psychological treatments, military training programs, and experimental research projects that operate under the assumption that human awareness can be systematically altered for specific purposes. The ethical implications of these applications remain largely unexplored, but the potential for abuse is enormous. The legacy of the 8 deadliest Appalachian families continues to influence contemporary society through channels that most people never recognize. Their work revealed potentials within human nature that civilization has spent centuries trying to suppress or deny, and their success in developing these potentials suggests that the boundaries between human and non-human consciousness are far more permeable than we typically acknowledge. The mountains may have kept their secrets, but those secrets have a way of shaping the world beyond their borders, and the influence of these families may be far more extensive than anyone realizes. The question that haunts researchers who study these accounts is whether the family's work represents an aberration in human history or a glimpse into potentials that exist within all human communities. The isolation of the Appalachian Mountains may have simply provided ideal conditions for the development of capabilities that remain dormant in more civilized environments. If this is true, then the techniques developed by these families could theoretically be recreated anywhere that similar conditions exist, and their influence on human consciousness may be far from finished. The story of these families serves as both a warning and a reminder that human consciousness is far more complex and dangerous than we typically acknowledge. The potential for both transcendence and horror exists within human nature itself, and the conditions that allowed these families to explore that potential could theoretically emerge again. The comfortable assumptions we make about human limitations may be nothing more than illusions that help us function in civilized society, and the work of the 8 deadliest Appalachian families may have revealed truths about human nature that we're not prepared to accept. As we continue to uncover evidence of their activities and influence, we're forced to confront the possibility that these families succeeded in creating forms of consciousness that transcend normal human limitations. The hollow beings, death-touched individuals, and other modified humans they produced may represent evolutionary developments that could eventually replace conventional human consciousness entirely. The implications of this possibility are staggering, and the response of contemporary society to these revelations will determine whether the family's legacy represents a threat to be contained or a transformation to be embraced. The mountains still hold their secrets, but those secrets continue to influence the world beyond their borders. The work of the 8 deadliest Appalachian families may have ended over a century ago, but their impact on human consciousness and capability continues to shape our understanding of what it means to be human. The question that remains is whether we're prepared to confront the implications of their discoveries, or whether we'll continue to pretend that the comfortable assumptions we make about human nature are sufficient to protect us from the potentials they revealed. The investigation into these families revealed something that federal authorities had never encountered before: evidence that their techniques were being preserved and transmitted through methods that defied conventional understanding. Hidden throughout the Appalachian wilderness, investigators discovered what they termed teaching sites, locations where the families had established permanent installations designed to pass their knowledge to future generations. These sites weren't simple hiding places or storage facilities. They were elaborate educational complexes carved into mountain sides, concealed behind natural formations, and designed to remain functional for decades without maintenance. Each site contained detailed instructional materials, practice chambers, and even preserved specimens that demonstrated the family's techniques with scientific precision. The most disturbing aspect of these discoveries was the evidence that the sites had been designed for use by individuals who had never directly encountered the families themselves. Detailed written instructions, illustrated guides, and even what appeared to be training programs had been prepared for future practitioners who would need to learn the family's methods independently. This suggested that the families had always intended their work to continue long after their own disappearance. The federal response to these discoveries was immediate and comprehensive. Specialized teams were deployed to locate and neutralize every teaching site that could be found, but the task proved more challenging than anticipated. The families had concealed their installations using techniques that made them nearly impossible to detect from the surface, and many sites were discovered only after extensive excavation and systematic searching of entire mountain ranges. Each discovered site revealed new aspects of the family's work that investigators had never suspected. The families hadn't just been conducting isolated experiments. They had been developing comprehensive educational systems designed to create new generations of practitioners who could continue their work indefinitely. The scope of their planning suggested that they had been preparing for their own disappearance while ensuring that their techniques would survive and evolve. The psychological impact on the investigators themselves became a critical concern as the true scope of the family's legacy became clear. Agents who spent extended periods studying the teaching sites began displaying behavioral changes that suggested they were being influenced by the educational materials they were investigating. The sites had been designed to gradually introduce practitioners to increasingly advanced techniques, and even casual exposure to these materials seemed to create lasting psychological effects. The most experienced investigators reported that the teaching sites created a form of intellectual seduction. The materials were presented in ways that made them seem reasonable and beneficial, gradually leading readers toward acceptance of concepts that they would have rejected under normal circumstances. This effect was so pronounced that strict protocols were implemented to limit exposure time and require psychological evaluation for all personnel involved in the investigation. The family's understanding of human learning and psychological conditioning was demonstrated through the sophisticated design of their educational materials. They had developed techniques for presenting disturbing concepts in ways that minimized psychological resistance, gradually acclimatizing readers to ideas that would normally trigger strong negative reactions. This approach suggested that the families possessed advanced understanding of human psychology that extended far beyond their specific areas of expertise. The teaching sites also revealed the family's long-term strategy for expanding their influence beyond the Appalachian region. Detailed plans were discovered for establishing similar sites throughout the eastern United States, creating a network of educational facilities that could train practitioners in multiple locations simultaneously. These plans suggested that the families had been preparing for a systematic expansion of their operations that would have brought their techniques to communities across the entire region. The materials found at these sites indicated that the families had been developing simplified versions of their techniques that could be learned and applied by individuals with minimal training. These abbreviated methods weren't as sophisticated as the full procedures used by the families themselves, but they were designed to produce similar results with reduced risk of detection or failure. The implications of this development were staggering. The families had been working toward the democratization of consciousness modification techniques. The discovery of these simplified techniques raised disturbing questions about how widely the family's methods might have already spread. If individuals could learn basic consciousness modification procedures from materials that could be easily concealed and transmitted, then the family's influence might have extended far beyond their documented territories. The possibility that simplified versions of their techniques had been circulating in the general population for decades represented a threat that law enforcement agencies were completely unprepared to address. Federal investigators found evidence that some of the teaching sites had been accessed by individuals who weren't directly connected to the families. Signs of recent use, modified materials, and even new additions to the original installations suggested that the family's educational systems had been discovered and utilized by subsequent practitioners. This indicated that the family's work was continuing through individuals who had learned their techniques independently. The psychological profiles developed for these unknown practitioners revealed patterns that were both familiar and disturbing. Like the original families, these individuals seemed to be driven by intellectual curiosity about the nature of human consciousness, but their methods showed signs of innovation and adaptation that suggested they were developing new techniques based on the family's original work. The possibility that consciousness modification methods were evolving and improving through independent research represented a threat that could potentially exceed the dangers posed by the original families. The investigation revealed that the families had anticipated this development and had designed their educational materials to encourage independent innovation. Advanced practitioners were provided with theoretical frameworks that could be applied to develop new techniques, and the teaching sites contained experimental facilities where new methods could be tested and refined. This approach suggested that the families had been working toward the creation of a self-sustaining research community that could continue advancing their work indefinitely. The federal response to these discoveries involved the establishment of monitoring programs designed to detect signs of consciousness modification activity in the general population. These programs, operating under the highest levels of security classification, represented the government's first systematic attempt to identify and track individuals who might be using techniques derived from the family's work. The results of these monitoring efforts remained classified, but leaked documents suggested that evidence of ongoing consciousness modification activity had been detected in multiple locations. The monitoring programs revealed patterns of behavior that were consistent with the use of consciousness modification techniques, but occurred in contexts that seemed completely unrelated to the original families. Therapeutic communities, religious groups, and even academic institutions showed signs of employing methods that appeared to be derived from the family's work. This suggested that the family's techniques had been adapted for use in legitimate settings, making detection and intervention extremely difficult. The most disturbing aspect of these discoveries was the evidence that consciousness modification techniques were being used for purposes that their original developers had never intended. While the families had focused primarily on creating specific types of modified humans for their own purposes, contemporary practitioners seem to be using similar methods for goals ranging from therapeutic treatment to religious conversion to simple personal enhancement. The potential applications were virtually unlimited, and the ethical implications were staggering. The family's influence on contemporary society extends far beyond their direct victims and the government agencies that investigated them. Their work demonstrated that human consciousness is far more malleable than most people realize, and that the techniques for modifying awareness can be learned and applied by individuals with relatively limited training. The democratization of consciousness modification represents a fundamental shift in the nature of human experience that society is ill-equipped to understand or control. The question that haunts researchers who study these accounts is whether the family's work represents the beginning of a transformation in human consciousness that will eventually affect the entire population. The techniques they developed for modifying awareness, creating new forms of consciousness, and transcending normal human limitations may have started a process that will continue to evolve and spread regardless of efforts to contain it. The implications of this possibility are both terrifying and fascinating. The story of the 8 deadliest Appalachian families serves as a reminder that human consciousness is far more complex and dangerous than we typically acknowledge. Their work revealed potentials within human nature that civilization has spent centuries trying to suppress or deny, and their success in developing these potentials suggests that the boundaries between human and non-human consciousness are far more permeable than we typically acknowledge. The mountains may have kept their secrets, but those secrets continue to influence the world beyond their borders. The legacy of these families continues to shape our understanding of what it means to be human. Their techniques for consciousness modification, identity transfer, and the creation of new forms of awareness have implications that extend into every aspect of human experience. The comfortable assumptions we make about the nature of consciousness, the boundaries of individual identity, and the potential for human transformation may be nothing more than illusions that help us function in civilized society. As we continue to uncover evidence of their activities and influence, we're forced to confront the possibility that these families succeeded in initiating a transformation in human consciousness that extends far beyond their original intentions. The hollow beings, death-touched individuals, and other modified humans they created may represent evolutionary developments that could eventually replace conventional human consciousness entirely. The work they began in the isolated hollows of Appalachia may have started a process that will continue to unfold for generations to come. The mountains still hold their secrets, but those secrets continue to influence the world beyond their borders. The techniques developed by the 8 deadliest Appalachian families may have ended over a century ago, but their impact on human consciousness and capability continues to shape our understanding of what it means to be human. The question that remains is whether we're prepared to confront the implications of their discoveries, or whether we'll continue to pretend that the comfortable assumptions we make about human nature are sufficient to protect us from the potentials they revealed. In the end, the story of these families serves as both a warning and a revelation. They demonstrated that the boundaries of human consciousness are far more flexible than we typically acknowledge, and that the potential for both transcendence and horror exists within human nature itself. The isolation of the Appalachian Mountains provided ideal conditions for the development of these capabilities, but the techniques they developed could theoretically be recreated anywhere that similar conditions exist. Their legacy continues to influence contemporary society through channels that most people never recognize, and their work may have initiated a transformation in human consciousness that will continue to unfold for generations to come. The comfortable world we think we inhabit may be nothing more than a temporary illusion, and the work of the 8 deadliest Appalachian families may have revealed the truths about human nature that we're not prepared to accept. The mountains keep their secrets, but those secrets have a way of shaping the world beyond their borders, and the influence of these families may be far more extensive than anyone realizes. The question that haunts us is whether their work represents an aberration in human history or a glimpse into potentials that exist within all human communities, and whether we're prepared for the implications of either possibility.